What if I told you that the gods you deem dead are alive and dwell inside your mind? Not as metaphors, not as beliefs, but as psychic operating systems, running in the background and dictating 90% of your choices, your fears, and your most unspeakable desires. Think of Hercules. You see him as a myth, but the structure of his journey, the call, the refusal, the 12 labors against the inner monsters is the same script your soul follows. When you decide to change careers, end a toxic relationship, or confront an addiction, you are not imitating the myth. The myth is living through you. This is the most shocking and most liberating truth that Carl Jung's depth psychology has bequeathed to us, that the human psyche is a house haunted by millennia-old ghosts. And these ghosts, the archetypes, are the true architects of our destiny. The love story that consumes you, the enemy you cannot forgive, the search for a purpose that keeps you awake at night. All of this has already been written, not in the stars, but in the collective unconscious of our species, and myths are the source language of this code. What we will do here, together, is dangerous. It is an active rebellion against an era that wants us to be superficial, distracted, and disconnected from our own depth. This channel is not entertainment. It is a refuge, a laboratory for souls, for those who feel that there is something more, something vast and ancient pulsing beneath the skin of everyday reality. If you feel this call, if your soul is hungry for a knowledge that truly nourishes, then this is your place. Subscribe to claim your place in this circle of psychic explorers. Activate notifications, because each video is a step on a ladder that descends into the depths of your being. Leave your mark of light on this video with a like, so the algorithm knows that this message needs to find other seekers like you. And most importantly, share in the comments which myth or legendary figure has always haunted or inspired you. Your comment is the first step in bringing that unconscious force into the light of consciousness. Now, prepare yourself. The descent begins. In an era dominated by scientific rationalism, where the psyche was seen as a blank slate to be filled by experience, Carl Jung's decision to turn to myths, alchemy, and fairy tales seemed an act of academic heresy. Why would an empirical physician and scientist immerse himself in narratives considered primitive or fanciful? The answer reveals the genius of his vision. Jung understood that the psyche is not a modern invention. It is the oldest structure we possess, a psychic organ that has evolved over hundreds of thousands of years. And if a biologist studies fossils to understand the evolution of the body, Jung realized he needed to study myths to understand the evolution of the soul. He did not see myths as flawed, pre-scientific explanations of the external world, as his contemporaries did. He saw them as fantastically accurate descriptions of the inner world. Every god, every demon, every impossible journey was an account, in symbolic language, of the objective and autonomous forces that inhabit the unconscious, the archetypes. For him, to ignore mythology when studying the psyche was like trying to understand Roman culture while ignoring Latin. Myths are the native language of the soul. They are proof that our ancestors were no less psychologically complex. On the contrary, they lived with an intimacy with the inner world that we, in our modern arrogance, have lost. They did not need a theory of the Oedipus complex, because they had the story of Oedipus, which dramatized this dynamic in a much more visceral and complete way. They did not need a manual on the midlife crisis, because they had the story of Inanna's descent into the underworld, a perfect map of the necessary death of the ego for the renewal of life. Jung, therefore, was not abandoning science. He was expanding its scope. He was practicing a kind of psychic archaeology, excavating the layers of stories and legends to find the fundamental structures, the bones, of our collective mind. He taught us that when a patient in Zurich in 1920 described a dream of a serpent devouring the sun, he was not having a personal hallucination, but reenacting one of humanity's oldest myths, that of the struggle between the light of consciousness and the devouring darkness of the unconscious. This insight is transformative. Our most intimate dramas are not just our own. They are universal, they are human, and they have already been navigated and mapped by countless generations before us, who left us myths as a survival guide for the dangerous and magnificent journey of the soul. Archetypes are Jung's most radical and most misunderstood concept. They are not, as many think, inherited images or ideas. No one is born with an innate image of Zeus or the Great Mother in their head. Instead, an archetype is an inherited predisposition to produce the same universal images and ideas. It is like the dry bed of a river. The water life experience can come from anywhere, but it will tend to flow along the same ancient path, carved by millennia of flow. These psychic riverbeds are the archetypes. They are energy centers in the collective unconscious, empty molds that are filled by the content of our individual lives, but whose form is universal and timeless. This is why cultures that never had contact with one another developed myths about a hero who slays a dragon, a flood that purifies the world, or a god who dies and is resurrected. It was not due to cultural diffusion, but because the very structure of the human psyche is predisposed to interpret the fundamental experiences of life, birth, death, love, conflict, transformation through these archetypal patterns. The experience of an archetype is overwhelming, numinous. When a man falls madly in love, he is not just reacting chemically to a woman. He is having his anima, the archetype of the inner feminine, projected onto her, transforming her into a goddess. When a mother defends her child with a fury she never knew she possessed, she is no longer just herself. She becomes an embodiment of the terrible mother archetype. Myths are the dramatization of these archetypal possessions. The Greek pantheon, for example, is not a collection of fairy tales. It is a complete psychological system. Ours is the personification of the archetypal fury of war, impersonal and destructive. Aphrodite is the overwhelming beauty and passion that dissolves reason. Athena is strategic wisdom and the clarity of the logos. When the Greeks said a man was seized by ours, it was a psychologically accurate description of a state of blind rage. To understand the archetypes is to understand that you are not the sole resident of your psychic house. You are the caretaker of an inner pantheon, and these inner gods demand recognition and respect. Denying them doesn't make them disappear. On the contrary, it makes them operate in the darkness, sabotaging your life in ways you don't understand, creating neuroses, compulsions, and tragic destinies, just as the gods punished mortals who challenged them with their hubris. The true wisdom, taught by the myths, is not to defeat these inner gods, but to learn to dance with them. The hero's journey, popularized by Joseph Campbell but with deep roots in Jung's psychology, is not just the structure behind almost every successful film and book. It is the fundamental map of the process of individuation, the psyche's path toward wholeness. Each stage of this journey corresponds to a crucial phase of psychological development. It all begins with the ordinary world, the ego's comfort zone, the life we know, which is functional but incomplete. Then comes the call to adventure, an event, a dream, a crisis that disrupts this normality and points toward an unlived potential. It could be a job loss, the end of a relationship, or a deep sense of emptiness. The ego's first reaction is almost always the refusal of the call. It's too dangerous, too risky. The ego fears annihilation, and with good reason. But if the call is authentic, there will be a meeting with the mentor, who can be a real person, a book, or a sudden inner clarity, the archetype of the wise old man manifesting to offer a map, a tool, or the courage needed for crossing the first threshold. This is the point of no return, where the hero leaves the known world and enters the special world, the realm of the unconscious. Here he faces tests, allies, and enemies, which are manifestations of his internal complexes, his strengths, and his weaknesses. The journey leads him to the approach to the inmost cave, the most dangerous place, which prepares him for the supreme ordeal. This is the confrontation with the shadow, the encounter with the Minotaur in the center of the labyrinth, the battle with the dragon. It is the moment of symbolic death, where the old ego, with its defenses and limitations, must die so that something new can be born. If the hero survives, he obtains the reward, the treasure, which symbolizes a new consciousness, a hard-won wisdom, the integration of a previously disowned part of the psyche. But the journey doesn't end there. There is the road back, which is often as perilous as the way in, as the forces of the unconscious do not want to let the hero leave with the treasure. He must flee, be rescued, or fight his way back to the ordinary world. The final stage is the resurrection, a last test to prove that the transformation is real, followed by the return with the elixir. The hero returns to his world, but he is no longer the same. He brings with him the elixir, the wisdom, the healing, the new perspective to renew his community and his own life. This pattern, from Odysseus to Buddha, from Luke Skywalker to Frodo, is our pattern. Every crisis in our lives is a call. Every fear is a threshold. Every confrontation with a painful truth about ourselves is the battle with the dragon. The myth assures us that the descent into darkness is not an end, but a prerequisite for resurrection. The shadow is perhaps the most accessible archetype and, at the same time, the most difficult to confront. Is our other self, our dark brother, the repository of everything we consider inferior, shameful, or evil in ourselves, and which, for that reason, we repress and hide from the light of consciousness. It is composed of our most primitive instincts, our negative emotions, anger, envy, greed, lust, and our undeveloped potentials that did not fit the persona, the social mask we present to the world. The shadow is not inherently evil, it is just unlived. However, the more we repress it, the darker and more hostile it becomes. And the most common way of dealing with it is through projection. We project our shadow onto others. That which irritates us most, which we judge and condemn most in another person or group, is often a quality of our own shadow that we refuse to see in ourselves. The moralistic fanatic who condemns the sins of others is often fighting desperately against his own repressed impulses. Myths are a theater of the shadow. The antagonist, the monster, the villain, is almost never just an external force of evil. He is the hero's personified shadow. The civilized Dr. Jekyll is haunted by the bestial Mr. Hyde, his unleashed shadow. The righteous Osiris is murdered by his envious brother, Set. In Christian mythology, Lucifer is not an independent entity, but the brightest angel who fell through pride and archetypal shadow of God himself. The function of the monster in the myth is to force the hero to confront the darkness he carries within. Grendel, the beastly creature that attacks King Hrothgar's hall in Beowulf, is the personification of primordial chaos and savagery that civilization and order try to suppress. Beowulf must descend into his underwater lair, a clear symbol of the unconscious, to confront him on his own territory. The crucial lesson that myths teach us is that the shadow cannot be destroyed. It must be integrated. To destroy it would be to destroy a vital part of ourselves, our instinctual energy, our raw creativity, our depth. Jung said that the shadow contains gold, hidden in the darkness of our repressed traits, our talents and strengths that, if brought to light and refined by consciousness, can make us more complete and powerful individuals. The work of integrating the shadow is what the alchemists called the nigredo, the stage of blackening, the dissolution into the dark prima materia. It is a painful and humbling work, as it requires us to withdraw our projections, to admit our own capacity for evil, and to take responsibility for our entire being. But it is the only path to wholeness. A man who is not in touch with his own shadow is an incomplete man, dangerously naive and prone to becoming a puppet of forces he does not understand. Within every man, according to Jung, there exists an inner image of the feminine, the anima, and within every woman, an inner image of the masculine, the animus. These are not representations of sexuality, but archetypal figures that personify the contrasexual qualities of the psyche. The anima in a man represents the dimension of eros, the capacity for relatedness, for feeling, intuition, and connection with nature and the unconscious. The animus in a woman represents the dimension of logos, rational thought, structure, assertiveness, and the capacity for discernment. These figures are initially shaped by our first experiences with the opposite sex. Mother for the boy, father for the girl, but their essence is archetypal and universal. In an unconscious state, these figures are projected. A man falls in love at first sight because a woman perfectly matches the image of his unconscious anima. He doesn't see her as she is, but as the goddess he has projected onto her. This creates the magic of infatuation, but also the inevitable disillusionment when the projection withdraws and human reality appears. A woman can be dominated by a negative animus, manifesting as rigid, critical opinions, and an argumentative spirit that destroys relatedness eros. Myths are the portrait gallery of the anima and animus. The anima manifests in 4 stages of development. First, as Eve, the purely biological and instinctual figure. Second, as Helen of Troy, the romantic and sexualized figure, who inspires great deeds but also great destruction. Third, as the Virgin Mary, the spiritualized figure, who elevates love to a devotional plane. And fourth, as Sophia, the personification of divine wisdom, who guides man toward wholeness. The animus also has its stages, from the man of pure physical strength, the Tarzan, through the man of action and initiative, the hero, the man of the word and authority, the professor, or priest, to the embodiment of meaning and spirituality, the guide. Myths like that of Hades and Persephone can be read as a drama of integration. Persephone, the innocent maiden infantile anima, is abducted and taken to the underworld, the male unconscious, by Hades. There, she transforms from a passive girl into the queen of the underworld, a powerful figure who integrates darkness and light. The work of individuation requires that we withdraw these projections from the external world and begin to relate to this inner figure. For a man, this means developing his own eros, his capacity to feel and relate, instead of expecting a woman to do it for him. For a woman, it means developing her own logos, her clarity of thought, and her inner authority, instead of seeking it in an external male figure. The integration of the anima, or animus, is what Jung called the sacred marriage within, the union of opposites that creates a more complete, creative, and conscious human being. When the hero's journey becomes too difficult, when the path ahead is dark and confusion reigns, two fundamental archetypes often emerge from the unconscious to offer help: the wise old man and the great mother. They represent the ancestral knowledge, wisdom, and support that exist within the psyche itself. The wise old man, or senex, is the personification of meaning, spirit, and introspection. He doesn't fight the hero's battles for him, but he offers him a crucial piece of advice, a magical tool, or an insight that changes the course of his journey. He is Merlin to King Arthur, Gandalf to Frodo, Obi-Wan Kenobi to Luke Skywalker. In myths, he appears as a prophet, a wizard, a hermit, or an elderly king. In our dreams, he might be a teacher, a priest, or any authority figure who offers us unexpected guidance. The wise old man represents the logos, the wisdom that comes from reflection and accumulated knowledge. However, like every archetype, he has a shadow. The negative wise old man is the old fool, the dogmatist who clings to petrified knowledge and impedes progress, or the evil sorcerer who uses his knowledge to manipulate and destroy. In contrast, we have the Great Mother, the archetype who governs the realm of nature, the body, nourishment, and feeling. She is the source of all life, the womb from which all things are born and to which all things return. She is Demeter, the goddess of the harvest, Gaia, the earth itself, or Isis, who gathers the pieces of her beloved Osiris. In fairy tales, she is the fairy godmother who offers comfort and the magic necessary for the heroine to go to the ball. She represents Eros, the wisdom of the heart and of connection. Her domain is not that of the word, but of direct experience, of the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. The shadow of the Great Mother is the terrible mother, the devouring mother who refuses to let her children grow. She is the witch who imprisons Hansel and Gretel, the goddess Kali with her necklace of skulls, or the Medusa who petrifies with her gaze. She represents stagnation, the power of the unconscious that threatens to swallow consciousness and drag the ego back to a state of infantile dependency. Throughout our lives, we are constantly influenced by these two great forces. We seek meaning and order, the wise old man, but also connection and belonging, the Great Mother. A life dominated only by the logos of the wise old man becomes dried, arid, and disconnected from the body and emotion. A life dominated only by the eros of the Great Mother becomes chaotic, undifferentiated, and directionless. The process of individuation involves honoring both archetypes, integrating the wisdom of the mind with the wisdom of the heart, and learning to discern when their counsel is beneficial and when their shadows threaten to imprison us. Myths show us that the successful hero is one who listens to his mentors, but who in the end walks on his own defeat. Every culture has a creation myth, cosmogony, and often a myth of the end of the world, eschatology. From the biblical Genesis, where order emerges from the word of God upon the watery chaos, to the Norse myth of Gylfaginning, where the world is born from the meeting of fire from Muspelheim and ice from Niflheim in the void of Ginnungagap. these myths describe the emergence of consciousness order light, the created world from the vast and undifferentiated unconscious chaos darkness, the void. Psychologically, each of us repeats this cosmogony. A child's consciousness slowly emerges from the ocean of the unconscious, and throughout life, we go through countless cycles of creation. Each time we start a new project, a new relationship, or develop a new part of our personality, we are reenacting the act of creation, bringing order to a new chaotic corner of our lives. The ego, in its desire for stability, would like creation to be a what-I'm event. It builds a world, an identity, a belief system, and wishes for it to remain static forever. But the psyche, like nature, is dynamic. It demands renewal, and for something new to be born, the old must die. This is where the myths of destruction come in. The Norse Ragnarok, where gods and giants annihilate each other in a final battle so that a new, greener world can emerge. The flood, present in countless cultures, that washes away the corruption of the old world to allow for a new beginning. The Hindu goddess Kali, who dances on the bodies of demons and gods, destroying the universe so that Brahma can recreate it. Psychologically, these apocalyptic events correspond to the great crises of life, the dark night of the soul, deep depression, the loss of a job, a love, or faith. These are moments when the world we have built for ourselves falls apart. The ego experiences this as a catastrophe, an end. But from the soul's perspective, it is a necessary process of purification and renewal. It is the alchemical fire that burns away impurities, the flood that dissolves the rigid and outdated structures of the ego. Depression, seen through this lens, is not just a pathology to be medicated and eliminated. It is often the refusal of the body and soul to continue living an inauthentic life. It is the necessary descent into the watery chaos, the winter of the psyche, which precedes the spring of a new creation. The fear of destruction is, in fact, the ego's fear of losing control. Myths, however, offer us a profound consolation. They assure us that the end is never the end. After Ragnarok, a new sun rises. After the flood, a new covenant is made. Destruction is not annihilation, but transformation. It is the prerequisite for a higher and more integrated level of consciousness. The psychological task is not to avoid the apocalypse, but to learn to navigate it, trusting that on the other side of the fire and the flood, a truer world awaits to be built. In almost every mythological pantheon, there is a figure who refuses to play by the rules. He is the trickster. He is the Norse Loki, who lives among both gods and giants, helping and sabotaging both. He is the Greek Hermes, the thief and messenger of the gods, patron of merchants and liars. He is the coyote in Native American traditions, a figure who is at once creator and destroyer, fool and sage. The trickster is an archetype of creative chaos. His function is to break taboos, challenge authority, and expose the hypocrisy and rigidity of the established system. He is the agent of change, the force that prevents the world from becoming stagnant and complacent. Where there is a rule, he bends it. Where there is a boundary, he crosses it. He operates on the margins, on the threshold between order and chaos, the divine and the profane. Psychologically, the trickster represents that part of us that rebels against our own rigid ego structures. When we take ourselves and our social personas too seriously, when we become inflated with our own importance or stuck in a lifeless routine, the trickster's energy emerges to play a trick on us. This can manifest as an embarrassing Freudian slip, a stupid accident that forces us to slow down, or a sudden impulse to do something completely irrational and out of character. The ego loathes the trickster. He is unpredictable, amoral, and threatens its control. But from the perspective of the self, the organizing center of the psyche, the trickster is indispensable. He is the safety valve that prevents pressure from building to the point of explosion. He brings humor and humility, reminding us that we are not the absolute masters of our own house. The stories of the trickster are often paradoxical. He can cause a disaster, like Loki engineering the death of Balder, the most beloved god. But often his chaotic actions end up, inadvertently, bringing about a greater good. His tricks force the gods, the ego, to find new solutions, to adapt, and to evolve. He is the catalyst who, through disorder, paves the way for a new, more flexible, and more complete order. Modern society, with its emphasis on efficiency, control, and seriousness, has little room for the trickster. We repress him, labeling him as childish, irresponsible, or destructive. But in doing so, we run a great risk. A psyche without the trickster's influence becomes a totalitarian system, rigid and brittle. Neurosis and stagnation set in. Learning to recognize and give safe space to the trickster's energy in our lives through creativity, humor, spontaneity, and the ability to laugh at ourselves is essential for psychological health. He reminds us that sometimes the wisest way to solve a serious problem is to stop taking it so seriously. If the hero's journey is the map of the process, what is the destination? For Jung, the ultimate goal of individuation is not perfection, but wholeness. And the archetype that represents this wholeness, this union of all the opposites in the psyche, is the self. The self is not the ego. The ego is merely the center of consciousness, the small island we know. The self is the center of the entire psyche, including consciousness and the vast ocean of the unconscious. It is the ordering principle that contains all that we are and all that we can become. If the ego is the king of the land, the self is the entire cosmos that contains that land. The self is the God within, the image of God in the human soul. To experience the self is to feel a deep connection to something greater than our small self, a sense of order, meaning, and belonging in the universe. But how can such a vast and transcendent force be represented? Throughout history, the human psyche has spontaneously produced a universal symbol for the self, the mandala. The Sanskrit word mandala means circle, but it is much more than that. It is a circle, often contained within a square or with a quaternary structure inside it, that possesses a unifying center. We find mandalas everywhere, in the rose windows of Gothic cathedrals, in Aztec calendars, in the yantras of Hinduism, and most famously, in the sand paintings of Tibetan Buddhism. Jung discovered that his patients, at crucial moments in their therapeutic process, would begin to draw or dream of mandalas spontaneously, without any prior knowledge of their meaning. He realized that the psyche, in times of chaos and disorientation, produces this symbol of order and wholeness as a way to self-regulate, to heal itself. The circle represents the totality of the psyche, while the square or the four-part structure quaternity represents earthly reality, and the need to integrate the four aspects of consciousness: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. The center of the mandala is the point from which everything emanates, and to which everything returns the self. Myths are also replete with symbols of the self. The philosopher's stone of the alchemists, which transmutes lead into gold and unites the opposites. The holy city, like the New Jerusalem, described as a perfect square with a divine center. Christ himself, often depicted in the center of a zodiacal circle or surrounded by the four evangelists. All of these are images of the self, symbols of the journey's ultimate goal, the unification of consciousness ego with the unconscious, of the masculine with the feminine, of light with darkness. Within a larger, more meaningful whole, the creation of a mandala, whether through art, meditation, or life itself, is an act of centering. It is a ritual that reminds us that, despite the apparent chaos of our lives, there's an ordering center within us, a core of peace and meaning that is unchanging. The journey of individuation, therefore, is not a straight line, but a spiral that circles ever closer to the center. It is the long and arduous pilgrimage back home, to the self. Just as an individual has a personal shadow, composed of their repressed aspects, a group, a nation, or even an entire era has a collective shadow. It is formed by all the inconvenient truths, moral failures, and dark instincts that a society refuses to acknowledge about itself. And, just like the individual, society deals with its collective shadow primarily through projection. It chooses a scapegoat, another nation, an ethnic minority, a political group, and projects all its fears and failings onto it. This group becomes the enemy, the embodiment of all evil, allowing the society to maintain a virtuous and inflated self-image while ignoring its own darkness. History is filled with tragic examples of the consequences of an unintegrated collective shadow. Nazi Germany projected its shadow onto the Jewish people, leading to one of the greatest horrors in history. During the Cold War, the United States, and the Soviet Union projected the archetype of the evil empire onto each other, justifying an arms race that threatened the planet. Today, we see the same dynamic in extreme political polarization, where each side sees the other not as an adversary with different ideas, but as the personification of absolute evil, a massive projection of the shadow that blinds us to our own flaws and responsibilities. Modern myths, which we find primarily in cinema and television, are a powerful mirror of the collective shadow. Think of zombie films. They represent our fear of a soulless, consumerist, unconscious humanity, an undifferentiated horde that reflects our anxiety about the loss of individuality in a massified world. Think of iconic villains like the Joker in The Dark Knight. He is the personification of chaos and nihilism, the shadow that emerges to expose the fragility of our society's order and morality. He argues that, under the right pressure, we would all become like him, a terrifying truth we prefer not to confront. Conspiracy theories, so prevalent today, are shadow myths in their purest form. They posit the existence of a secret, malevolent group, the Illuminati, the reptilians, etc., that controls the world. This is a more comfortable narrative than the chaotic and complex truth that the world is often governed by incompetence, chance, and the sum of millions of small, selfish decisions, including our own. Confronting the collective shadow is the most difficult and most urgent task of our time. It requires every nation to look at the darkest chapters of its own history, every group to acknowledge its own capacity for cruelty and selfishness. It requires each of us to withdraw our projections and begin to see the enemy not as a monster, but as a human being who, like us, carries both light and darkness. As long as we refuse to do this work, we will continue to feed the demons that haunt our world, repeating the same tragic cycles of conflict and destruction, enacting a dark myth whose ending may be the very apocalypse we fear. The only way out is in.